Hi everybody, welcome to the weekly wrap-up where we'll discuss various course-related matters. First, we want to give a huge thank you to everyone who's participated in the course so far. We've had a really great response and we're so happy for all the amazing comments on the discussion forums.
Yeah, the response has been great, and currently there are 4,777 of you enrolled in the course from 154 countries or regions around the world, which is great. We're so thrilled to see many parts of the world represented and are especially grateful for those of you who are including specific examples from your home countries and cultures in the discussion forums. Finance, FinTech, and tech disruptions are affecting various parts of the world in different ways, so it's great to hear your local perspectives on everything we're doing.
Yeah. In response to the poll questions, it was great to see that most of you believe an hour of education is worth more than 100 eggs. So I guess that means that you value education, which bodes well for our future as educators. But we also think it's cool that most of you wanted the whole chicken. This shows you're savvy negotiators.
Now, we also thought it was interesting that the majority of you out there still trust banks over FinTech startups and tech fins. But 28% of you out there don't trust any of them. Now, that's a really important statistic that we hope you explore personally and in the discussion forums as the course continues. You know, it's incredibly important that financial service firms do a better job establishing trust in the marketplace. And if you all out there are representative of the market, then it's clear many people around the world do not trust financial firms either.
And speaking of trusting banks, many of you commented that you trust banks more because they're better regulated and your deposits are insured. Now, while we agree and think that those are really reasonable ideas, it does make us wonder, isn't one of the major focuses of FinTech innovation to avoid regulation and government intervention? And isn't regulation one of the things that makes banks inefficient and hard to deal with in the first place? Now, we look forward to hearing your feedback as the course moves on to see how the FinTech and TechFin firms can continue to build trust while maintaining their efficiencies.
Now, when thinking about proximity, 77% of you said that you would pull the lever to divert the trolley from hitting the 5 people instead killing the 1 person. But on the other hand, 61% of you said that you would not push the man off the bridge to save the 5 people. These results largely mirror what academics have found as they researched these questions in the past. This is a great example of how proximity can alter our decision making.
And you provided a lot of really great examples of proximity affecting our behavior in real life. Now, some of you mentioned how we'd be willing to donate our organs to save a loved one, but maybe not do the same thing for strangers. Or how we often donate to our churches or charities in our local communities, but then don't do the same thing for problems that are affecting people far away. And one of you mentioned that's about stealing from a bank versus cybercrime. Now, we're going to talk about issues of bank theft in the next couple of modules, so remember that one for later.
Now, concerning the disruption that will come from tech innovation, a full 60% of you said that you were either very or somewhat concerned that disruption and the resulting job loss would create broad social problems. And interestingly, when asked what industries you thought were most at risk of disruption, 41% of you said accounting and auditing, while 34% said finance. By far the 2 most common answers. Is that because most of you are from the accounting and or finance industry, and therefore you see the risk of automation in those industries, or is this just an overall observation?
Yeah, I was wondering about that. Now, either way, we hope that you're all thinking more deeply about your life and your career and how you can kind of future-proof yourself, meaning planning ahead to ensure that you are not made redundant and are always employed in doing something that you love and that's meaningful for society.
Now, we also appreciated all the great comments about cultural lag. We know that this is probably a new concept for many of you, but basically cultural lag means that technology adapts and changes faster than culture, especially in areas like law and religion. And as a result, sometimes technology changes so fast that it takes a while for us to realize the negative impacts that technology may be having on society.
And you provided really good examples of cultural lag in everyday life, including the impacts of social media on teenagers, especially from cyberbullying, which is kind of a sad but really relevant thing. The spreading of fake news and false stories via social media, which is made possible because of the omnipresence of smartphone technology, and the environmental costs of mining Bitcoin. And that's one of the topics that we're going to discuss in the next module.
Finally, we also learned that students out there all over the world are smart and disciplined with your money. When asked what you would do with $1 million, you all answered really responsibly. We were expecting some really crazy answers like trips to Las Vegas or buying an island or something, but most of you talked about paying off debts, investing for their future, particularly your kids' schooling, and helping the community even. Now, in our next module, Module 2, we're going to look at blockchain and its governance. Now, we won't cover blockchain in too much technical detail in the next module, but more look at some of the policy implications and the governance implications of what blockchain technology means to us. We're going to look at a few interesting cases, including the Silk Road, which is a really fascinating case, almost straight out of a movie. Additionally, we'll look at some technical details of things related to like smart contracts and what that means. We'll also look at foreign remittances and how blockchain comes in and plays a significant role in transferring money from place to place. Now, there are obviously technical details around that. Now, we won't go into specific coding or anything like that, or cryptocurrency or anything along those lines, but we're going to look at some real-world implications of this new technology and how it really impacts people, and hopefully in some ways improves their lives.
Okay, so you're not going to be telling them what cryptocurrencies to buy?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have that knowledge. If we did, we probably wouldn't be sitting here and earning professor, teacher salaries from a university. All we can say is make sure you do your research.
Yeah, and as the course moves on, we hope that you all still really, maintain your engagement, and especially within the discussion forums. One of the things that we were super excited to see were all the comments from all over the world. We had comments from those in Kenya, all over South America, people from Europe, North America, and obviously here within the region of Asia where we are. It was super cool to see your comments, especially in terms of the very personal and kind of specific ways that these things apply within your local communities, within your specific jobs and careers, and hopefully in the way that you think these are going to be disrupting and changing the way those things operate, your communities operate, your career, your industries operate in the future. So please stay engaged, and we're really looking forward to more.
Yeah, and I'll echo what David Bishop has said. Some of the feedback we've gotten has been fabulous.
And really excellent, very thoughtful comments.
The comments have been great, which we appreciate. And at some point, we do get to all of them. One of us will look at all of them, and we'll read them and try to comment where we can. Additionally, some of you have told us that you finished the module, you thought it was great, and you've passed it on to your friends and colleagues and acquaintances. So if you feel like this is really compelling information and things that we're sharing and questions that you feel are important to think about and consider, please do introduce it to other people around you. And I think collectively we can have increase kind of the quality and quantity of the discussions we're having, because these are really important questions.
Yeah, one last point, because I have been reached out. So as we you're going to learn later on, this course talks a lot about migrant workers. And so I've actually been contacted by literally hundreds of foreign domestic workers here in Hong Kong, mostly from the Philippines. And we want to say thank you for joining us and say, don't worry if you're not a finance expert. We're super excited to have people from developing countries all over Asia and really all over the world that are looking into these insights and really kind of engaging in these topics and conversations with us. So if you don't understand everything, that's totally okay. And within the discussion forums, it's absolutely appropriate to ask questions, right? And really kind of engage with us in that level, because we really hope that all people and all communities can kind of benefit from these insights going forward.
Absolutely, because one of the key components, I think, of our course about this idea of the ethics of new technology, the risk of new technology, is that it should be inclusive, right? And part of our mission of doing this course is to create a greater level of financial literacy as well as digital literacy around some of these new trends, that people have the right questions and think about the right factors to weigh as we go about in this kind of aspect of the new world and technological future that we have.
Yeah, especially because it kind of gives the wrong impression that we actually know the answers. Yeah. I mean, the reality is these are very complicated, very complex problems that really haven't even fully developed yet. And so again, this is meant to be a broad conversation. And so we really appreciate all people of all levels, joining in and kind of sharing your insights, asking your questions, and we'll be asking them too. And we're very sincere in that, because we don't have the answers, but we hope that society and our community within the course can kind of develop some insights in some of these questions together. Okay, so speaking of the great discussions we've had, we did want to give a shout out to a few of the people that are posting, because we really appreciated some of their comments. So first of all, from Peter-NYC, he had some really good comments, and the one we want to talk about is about the way he highlighted kind of the role or the purpose of a business and kind of the way that society defines success. So he noted that maybe the behavior of Wells Fargo was to be expected, because what we're kind of taught in business school is that the role of business is to generate profits, especially for the shareholders, and that's exactly what they did. And more specifically on the kind of personal side, he said that for many people, the definition of success is really largely kind of tied to their paycheck, basically, right? So what were some of your thoughts about that?
So I thought Peter's comment, or Peter-NYC's comments, were super insightful. I think on the first point about what the purpose of business is as it relates to profitability, that has kind of entered into kind of academia and filtered into mainstream business roughly the last 3 to 4 decades.
Yeah, late 70s.
Yeah, as kind of like as the norm. And if you didn't do that, somehow that was incorrect. And actually, that's not true. And I think both of us teach that in our normal classes that we teach in business ethics and things like that. That actually. Outside of a few circumstances, actually profitability, profit maximization is actually not a legal requirement in many situations. And in terms of schools of thought, beyond kind of traditional University of Chicago, Milton Friedman-esque profit maximization, there are actually other schools of thought, which I think in Peter in his comments, he seems to be more heavily influenced by management gurus like Peter Drucker, who kind of subscribes to, who kind of advance some of the things I think Peter is discussing. So I think that's important to point out, that profit maximization is not the default and doesn't have to be. Increasing, there's been a shift away from that. I think to the second point about how we value ourselves, is it based on a paycheck? I think that I think Peter rightly points out, Peter-NYC rightly points out, that's faulty logic too. And if you are always
or at least it leads to maybe difficult unintended consequences.
Yeah. I mean, and if you're always measuring yourself at using that as the metric, you'll always be behind.
Yeah.
That's the one thing. You'll never be happy or satisfied. But we also know, psychologically speaking, that money actually doesn't bring happiness. Now, for sure, if you don't have money enough to cover kind of the needs that you have on a day-to-day basis, we also know that will make you unhappy psychologically. But we know that once you move beyond that, the more money you make doesn't necessarily make you happier.
And we both know enough wealthy people, I think, to say pretty definitively that the size of your checking account doesn't necessarily mean you earned it or you're smarter than everybody else, right?
Yeah, in many respects, you may have been luckier than everybody else.
Yeah. A lot of it's timing and whatnot. And so typically what I tell my students when we're teaching business ethics is that the coolest thing about the concept of success is that it's a completely subjective term and you get to define it. And so one of the things that we want to do within this course, the reason really, I think the underlying reason why we decided to do this anyway, is because we wanted to kind of highlight a different definition of success and have people, especially in the financial and kind of tech industries, think ahead and say, okay, what type of future do we want and how are we going to define success? And I think Peter-NYC, one of the things that's really encouraging is to see so many leaders in the financial industry really also leading now in this kind of fight against short-termism and fighting against this idea that all you should be doing is looking at the quarterly earnings statements and stuff, and really pushing towards more long-term investments. So you've got leaders at BlackRock and JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs and other places that are really, actually including Warren Buffett himself, saying that focusing only on short-term profits is probably a losing battle, and it's something that we need to move away from.
Yeah, and I think what's also interesting, some of the follow-up comments, or in the follow-up comment that Peter-NYC had, he talked about culture a little bit, which I think is really important. I think both at the individual level about how we measure ourselves, what success, that's all part of the cultural mantra that you want to have for your personal life. But also, I think he was talking about more organizationally at banks and things and other institutions, the culture that you have. And he shared an article where it talked about students who went to Harvard Business School. Yeah. Their idea was, I want to go change the world, but they come out wanting to work at an investment bank. Yeah. And having worked at an investment bank, having worked at an investment bank, there's nothing necessarily wrong with working at an investment bank, and that's fine. But the idea of how being in a particular culture then changes what seems to be important to you or what your aspirations are, I think that's important to understand, because I think if you have certain values, you want to put yourself in the culture or create the culture around you and within you to ensure that you can live true to those values, which I think is quite important.
Yeah, so that means Peter-NYC, if you are from NYC, if you're from New York City, which is one of the world's other great financial centers, then share this course with your friends and colleagues. And let's start changing the narrative and having people define success differently and start looking at the role of financial institutions and all companies in a more ethical and kind of morally centered way.
Thanks, Peter. We've got another comment from York HK, and hopefully that means you're in Hong Kong. You're so great. But the comment was in response to the question about who is responsible for the negative consequences, basically of tech innovation. And York HK talked about perhaps that the government, the burden of that responsibility lies on the government to find policies and fund policies through taxation to deal with the negative externalities related to these consequences of technological innovation. And so that raised a very interesting debate, I think, on the discussion board. And this is something we frequently discuss between ourselves and within our classes here at the University of Hong Kong about who is responsible for potentially the displacement of labor, people who can't find jobs, technological advances that may make certain companies obsolete.
Yeah.
Who are responsible for those things? Because on a wide scale, those things will happen and are already happening and have been happening. And again, that created a bit of a discussion. We have Jesse Lam, 2018 username. Responded, maybe the whole obligation didn't actually fall on the government, but there are other stakeholders who should get involved. So that's a great place to start with this very important question. And Dave, what do you think?
It's super complicated, and this is really at the crux of what we want to talk about for the whole course. And so again, I really appreciate the kind of sophisticated dialogue, very, very kind and thoughtful dialogue as well. I think one of the things we're trying to do is to foster a place where people can disagree in a respectful way, and we appreciate you for doing that. So on the one hand, you have the role of the government, and Jorg also mentioned, Jorg HK also mentioned statements within the World Economic Forum and the idea that, people are going to be displaced, right? And so there are going to be a lot of jobs that are new, invented, but there are going to be a lot of people who are not really able to move or upgrade within the workforce. And we're seeing that across the world, right? So again, I'm from the US. I'm from an area where they had a lot of manufacturing, even just a decade or two ago. In fact, I used to work. You may be surprised to hear. I used to work.
You used to work? Yes, yes, that is surprising.
I used to work in a woodworking factory. So I worked in a factory in rural southern Georgia with kind of salt of the earth, normal people. And the reality is that with automation, those are the types of jobs that over the past 20 years have largely gone away. And now
or moved to other countries because of cost.
Sure. Excuse me. Yeah, they've left my area of the U.S. And so you see a lot of areas where they used to have a lot of manufacturing work that is now gone. So in the Rust Belt, for example, Ohio, Pennsylvania, et cetera. And that has had a massive influence on politics and so many aspects of everyday life, including social ramifications such as the opioid crisis, which is now going on. So you can see this is like a domino effect of negative consequences. And so that's why it's so important for us to think ahead. And some of the comments that everyone made was that this is not just restricted now to manufacturing or previous to that agriculture. Right, so now we're seeing that people are saying, well, we think that finance is going to be disrupted. We think that accounting and auditing are going to be disrupted. We're former lawyers. We think that the legal field is going to be disrupted. And so the question is, how do we kind of re-educate and reintegrate workers back into society? And I do see Jesse Lam 2018's point, though. This is a problem. The government is typically reactive. Right? And often can't be proactive in these areas. And so we do need other aspects of society. And from the government standpoint, we need more proactive kind of positive incentives as well. So she mentioned tax policy, for example. So you can have tax policy that encourages people to donate to charities, for example. Well, maybe we can create tax policies that encourage more innovation or job creation and other things.
Yeah. And I think one thing that's important to point out is that this trend that David Bishop just described, and that was described by Jorg HK and followed on by Jesse Lam in the comments and discussion and by others, is that this trend of displacement of labor is actually not new. I mean, this is something we talk about a lot because of technology, maybe because at the pace of that disruption is increasing. Right. But even if we look back, 20 or 30 years even, and we look at sources or locations of manufacturing of like electronic goods or garments or shoes even, we saw this move from, it was in Japan, then moved over to places like Taiwan and Korea.
Including here in Hong Kong.
In Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Then moved over to mainland China, and mainland China was the place for much of that manufacturing because of low cost, somewhat skilled labor, and that was a nice combination. But as that skilled labor started to creep up in expenses, then much of that manufacture has moved either inward into other parts of China or actually to parts of Southeast Asia as well.
Right.
And so this pattern of displacement is not necessarily just driven by technology alone. Oftentimes it's obviously driven by cost, and those combinations I think are intersecting now to make that pace of change a bit faster than perhaps what we've seen. And so one thing that we I think need to do as we consider these problems is to place them in the proper historical context, understand that oftentimes we like to think the situation we're at that our point of history is quite unique, and frequently there could be some unique aspects of it, but most of the time something like that has probably happened in the past. So kind of putting it in the proper context is helpful. And I think the thing more practically speaking related to policies is that, I think if we rely on governments alone to solve the problem. The problem, kind of the issue that we run into is that there's usually a timeline mismatch. So particularly for governments and politicians where they're elected into office, their kind of view or their perspective of time is basically the time they're going to be in office or the time they're trying to get reelected. Whereas if you're the laborer who's getting displaced, your perspective may be very different. And so if we rely solely on government to solve those problems, to be frank, that could be a bit precarious. To be fair as well. And so in that capacity, then who is involved? So there's the government, obviously. There's the individual, but should industry be part of that process? Of course. I definitely think so. Should, educational institutions like us? Of course. I think there's a very healthy debate that could be had about, there are traditional research-based universities like we're at the University of Hong Kong, and they do serve their purposes in certain ways. But do all institutions of kind of tertiary education have to be like us? I don't necessarily think so.
Right.
And it could more of them be tailored to helping reskill people who potentially are at the risk of being displaced, for sure.
Yeah.
And I think we need to think about that, and then how certain tax policies, tax credits, government policies, government credits could be applied to make that more effective.
And there are a lot of government resources that are being utilized for that purpose now. So
at least in certain countries.
Schools in South Korea, for example, because there aren't as many children in primary and secondary schools, they're actually bringing in the elderly from the countryside to come in and learn how to read, and actually so they can keep those resources being fully utilized. And so here at the University of Hong Kong, so my colleagues and I actually created a weekend program called Empower You, where we bring in migrant workers, foreign domestic workers, mostly from the Philippines, and they come and use the resources and are taught by professors and company leaders and stuff in areas to help them improve their skills as well. Yeah. So I definitely agree with David Lee. This is not necessarily anything that is new. However, I do hope that there is one thing that is different from before. Like in all aspects of society and all aspects of learning, our hope is that we can learn from the mistakes of the past and kind of forge together a better version of the future this time around. So if we are going to make a difference, if we are going to have a better future, this means looking back at the last 30, 40 years, understanding what went well, what we can change, so that as this new wave, this new fourth industrial revolution kind of sets in, we will have a plan in place and society doesn't have to reap these kind of negative unintended consequences. One of the discussions that I found most interesting, probably because it kind of harkened back to my legal training, was the conversation about accountability, and especially who should be accountable for harmful, negative, maybe even untruthful things that are posted online. Should it be the person who posts them? Should it be the platform, or some combination of the two? And a lot of you kind of chimed in and said that it is the poster's fault and the poster should be accountable for anything that's harmful, anything that is untruthful. And so we had one comment from a user, and I'm not sure how to pronounce your username, Xeilani or something, Xeilani. Really, really insightful, kind of long comment that created a nice dialogue, really focusing on how it is the person who makes the comment that it should be responsible for those words, especially if it's untruthful, and how obviously the platform is also responsible for having kind of a range of tools to make sure that comments are being read and analyzed properly, but really at the end of the day, it's kind of up to us. And so my comment back was, well, totally makes sense, and actually regulation, which is required, is probably inevitable, or more regulation is inevitable. But one of the things that I was wondering was, who is it that we trust to define harmful or even untruthful, right? Because unfortunately, truth is often in the eye of the beholder, and it's often very difficult to kind of decide. And it kind of spurred a nice conversation. So where do you fall on this? I mean, there's no answer, and there's certainly no right or wrong answer yet. But in terms of this conversation of like increased regulation and kind of punishing the people that put harmful things up there versus the platforms, I mean, what are some of your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think, kind of big picture, if we look at the kind of the ecosystem, so to speak, of the relevant parties involved, there's obviously the content producer, there's the platform, there's the viewer.
Yep. Should
that responsibility be apportioned kind of amongst those main parties, or are there other parties that we're forgetting about that should also be included? So I think maybe that's one of the kind of the foundational questions you start with in terms of account. And if we look back at different forms of media publication, frequently it was the platform that had more responsibility for the content they were putting out. Now, the difference is...
Well, go ahead.
And here we go, right? This is the difference. So they screened.
Yeah.
Right? They could filter what they put out.
And publication was very, very hard, right? So there were only like a handful of newspapers, magazines, whatever, right?
And if you were an entry-level reporter, a generation ago, maybe you started off as a fact checker, right? And so this is why there was credibility associated with many publications that are kind of well-known newspapers or well-known kind of magazines, current events magazines, because people had a belief or a faith, and they had a system that kind of filtered out the things that were incorrect.
Yeah.
And if
and you had limited circulation, so you had to be truthful, because if you lose the consumer's trust, you lose their business.
And your advertising business as well, right? And then, and part of that too is if they did find a problem, they would clearly correct it. They would say this is a correction, this was incorrect in the last article or something like that. Yeah. And there was that kind of process that people felt like these were the norms of information kind of sharing and media. I think now with the platforms that we have, that's not the case, obviously, because you can produce something and it will kind of basically go through no screening on a lot of platforms and will just be posted. Right? And then, which is a very different kind of issue. And then if there are inaccuracies there, then that process of rolling that back is a little bit more difficult than we had in the past. Now, there are countries, I think, as we mentioned later in some of the modules, that are trying to address this through legislation. Singapore is one of these countries. United Kingdom is one of these countries. They're trying to introduce legislation to make platforms more responsible, particularly for the veracity or truthfulness of the things that are posted. And those are countries that have decided to go in a particular direction to make more platforms more responsible. It'll remain to be seen how that plays out, how it's implemented. Some of those laws are just planned, but they haven't passed any sort of legislation yet. And so that one, that'll be interesting. But two, I think one of the broader issues is for things like this, a lot of platforms, in terms of where they're hosted, where some of it's being stored, there's definitely a multi-country or multi-jurisdictional component of it. So just because you get one country on board doesn't actually mean you can solve the whole problem. So that's another problem.
So what he's getting to is the kind of legal concept. We talk about accountability, but let's be more specific and talk about liability, right? This is where it really gets challenging, because let's say that Shailani, or however you say your username, let's say that it should be the poster who is ultimately liable for what he or she or it, if it's a company or bot or something, posts, right? What if that person is located in a different country, which is very possible, if not likely? Do you have zero recourse in terms of finding and then actually suing that person? Right? So this is actually really reminiscent of legal discussions that went on actually in the 1970s, tied to manufacturing, very much like what we just talked about a moment ago. When manufacturing was done in one country, let's say the US, and you're manufacturing for US consumers, it's really easy if they manufacture something incorrectly and someone is harmed by it, you just go after the manufacturer. But then what happened was, all the manufacturing in the US started going abroad, overseas, right? And so then all of a sudden, if you buy a toy, or if you get a toy in a McDonald's Happy Meal that ends up unfortunately harming your child, let's say, you'd have to find the factory in that overseas country and actually go after them directly. That was almost impossible, which meant that product liability as an entire legal concept essentially became useless. And so then the result is they created something called strict liability, which means no fault liability. I know this is complicated, but basically, let me summarize by saying, the point of these laws is to ensure, if possible, that the injury doesn't occur in the first place. But then if it does, then the person who is most in the best position to make sure it doesn't happen actually kind of provides compensation to make the injured party whole, okay? So what that means is, what if you got some random person that you cannot identify, who's on some island somewhere that's making false or fake comments? Who is in the best position to ensure that doesn't happen? Maybe it's that individual, maybe it's Google, maybe it's Facebook, I don't really know. But here's the other side of the coin though, and this is where it gets really, really challenging. Because when you talk about restricting speech, you are unintentionally also limiting political speech, religious speech, etc. And this is actually playing out right now. So you have, because these large platforms, including YouTube, Facebook, etc., they're really concerned about fake news, hate speech, and these things that are kind of creating big lawsuits for them. They are now starting to pull off people from their platforms, including a disproportionate amount of very conservative political people that speak on political things, right? Commentators. And so now you have people that sit on that end of the political spectrum are saying, wait a minute, this is discrimination, right? How is it that our ideas are somehow harmful? How come our ideas? And again, that's easy for us to say when we disagree with those ideas, but what if it's your religion? What if it's your political ideas that are being suppressed because you're no longer able to get on that platform? These are very real concerns that on the one hand, we want to make sure that these false statements are addressed, but at the same time, we also have to understand that every time we limit speech, we're limiting one of the most fundamental rights that people have. So it's very challenging.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point and raises a connected question about, do people have right? They have a right to speech in most countries, right? Or a lot of the countries that we deal with, but do they have a right to that platform to express their speech?
It's a private platform.
Right,
Yeah,
and that raises other questions about kind of access, and at a certain point, access to certain digital platforms is that a right? Right now we generally say no, but in this broader debate, it becomes an interesting question. I think if we go through some of the discussion points in response to what Shay Lee first brought up, there were some really interesting points. I think Peter /NYC had another great comment about this idea of how we design some of these platforms, which we thought was really insightful. And if you go back and look at some of the early historical narrative around some of the widespread, kind of social media apps that most of us are familiar with, in a lot of situations, those founders and the initial kind of creators of this actually didn't have a deep understanding of what this would become, right? And so, on one hand, how do you, kind of a model for, we're going to have this kind of impact? Because at a certain point, when you're just, a handful of friends starting something and think, we're going to be able to influence 3 billion people in the world, that's pretty arrogant in some ways, or crazy, right? One or the other. And then, how do you model for that? That becomes a difficult question. But then once you start approaching that, should you be doing something for that, right? And that, again, raises an interesting and insightful question about this idea of, how do you create the right structure for these platforms to police themselves.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're going to talk about later on is access to algorithms, right? So as machine learning, AI, and these other things become more prevalent, we're using these things every day, whether you realize it or not, but as they become more prevalent, we have to understand these are literal black boxes where we can't see the algorithm. So I watched, do not do this, it's a waste of time. I watched a 23-minute video today from a prominent YouTuber about the YouTube algorithm and how difficult it is as a YouTuber to understand that algorithm and to create viral content. But what he was saying is that the reason why YouTube is getting more and more clickbaity, as he said, and why it's more relying on the thumbnails more and more, which is why you're seeing a lot of maybe irreverent pictures or things that really cause people to click on them, is because the way that they created the algorithm, it really rewards the click-through rate, CTR, the click-through rate. And so he was saying that you have to, as a creator, you can't be as thoughtful about those things because it's kind of driving people in that direction based on that algorithm. Now we can't see that algorithm, right? This is one of those things. And so the question going forward is, should we be able to, right? Should this be a public good? These are some of the questions that we're going to address into the future. And so I think, as we go forward, again, really, really appreciate these very thoughtful comments because these are the broad questions. These are the new social goods. These are the new commodities. And so as we move forward, as we think about how these companies should be operating, we really need to think through. Now, one last point. Sorry, I know this is already running long. One last point is, when we talk about these billionaires that own and operate these massive technology platforms, one thing to consider, which is totally new in this landscape, is that because of what is known as weighted voting rights, you now have people like Mark Zuckerberg who do not own a majority of the shares in their company anymore. So he does not own a majority of Facebook, and yet he has almost complete control over what Facebook does because every one of his shares has 10 voting rights versus if you own Facebook, you only get 1 voting right.
So it's a different class of shares.
Different class of shares. And so as a result of that, you have guys like Jeff Bezos or the people that own Alibaba that have an immense amount of power and control, not only over your data and privacy, which we're going to talk about going forward, but literally the news content that we read every day, right? The types of products that we see and buy, the type of news, right? Just so many things.
And ironically, I guess, the historical genesis, at least the modern historical genesis of modern around kind of weighted voting or multi-share class kind of structures was to allow kind of media companies to give them a little bit more of kind of editorial independence.
Protection
so they weren't
from shareholders.
protection from being influenced by, shareholders, I don't like you sharing this kind of truth. And so allowing them to insulate themselves from that. And now it's maybe kind of a little bit backwards. So that's interesting. I think the other thing that we've talked about in the past, but which is incredibly relevant to what you're talking about now in terms of the pervasiveness of some of these social media platforms and how they influence us. And we both use them a lot ourselves. And so we're not saying that by default they're evil, but more that we should just be aware. I think in my own work working with some technology companies and startups, it's incredible. And even if you talk to people who are on large social media platforms or look at how they describe the platform design, I mean, it's intentionally created so people stay on it. Right? The user interface is very much a combination of human behavior psychology as well as kind of graphic design and other things to make sure people stay on it. And a lot of people are putting together these platforms now as part of their design is what can we do to somewhat manipulate people to stay on it. And this is part of the business model. So it's important for us as consumers to be aware of that.
Okay, if you get us talking, we'll talk forever. So we're going to end here, but we hope to see you in the blockchain module so we can talk about how some of these new emerging technologies are going to be impacting our lives for good, maybe a little bit for the negative, and how you as an innovator, as someone in the finance industry, or just an interested party can utilize these technologies for your own life and for your own career.